welcome to the OrgDev Podcast. So, how do you help an organization imagine new ways of working to achieve aggressive strategic goals? Now, this is a difficult task in itself, but even more challenging in an organization with over 350,000 employees. We're joined from Seattle by Roger Kastner, who's organization design strategy lead at Starbucks. So obviously, as a coffee lover, I cannot tell you how happy I am to have Roger join us today. He's also the host of What Do You Know to Be True, which is a brilliant podcast, which you can actually find. And we'll add the link in the show notes today. Now, Starbucks, if you don't know it, is the biggest coffee shop chain in the world, but it's also a strong values-based, people-focused culture, but it also needs to balance financial performance about this, which makes it a fascinating organization to work with. So Roger works with leaders and teams to achieve transformational results by taking on the most challenging business problems and unlocking higher performance. And he's fascinated about the subject of joy at work and making work suck less. That's Adam Grant, isn't it? I can detect.
It is.
As a host of his podcast, he applies his insightful and inquisitive approach to interview practitioners with talent and making it a meaningful impact. He's had an incredibly fruitful career. In the past, he's been a board member of Global Visionaries, and he's led transformations at EY and other boutique consulting firms as well. And he's also a published author. He's the author of the Project Success Checklist. We love a checklist here. And that's all about how to produce results and reducing the risk of project failure. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us, Roger.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. Appreciate that. And yes, thank you for your patronage.
Well, it's lovely to have you join us, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you.
So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit about the work that you do. What does your role involve?
I refer to myself as an org development practitioner, and usually people have no idea what that means. And so when I'm at parties on the golf course and people are like, what is that? I tell them, if you've seen the movie Office Space, I'm like one of the Bobs. But if you remember, the Bobs identified what the problem was with that organization. Again, if you're familiar with the movie, the org development piece I tend to think of as a combination of leadership development, team effectiveness, change management, op model org design. And, by that time, I usually get eyes glazing over and, people don't want to talk to me anymore, or they want to geek out. And I hope this is a conversation where we're going to geek out. I tend to focus in the area of op model org design because I see it as the fulcrum in that continuum from vision and strategy to the daily work experience, lived experience of the workforce. And that strategy by itself looks great on posters and t-shirts, but unless it's embedded in the work and how people show up and work together, we're not going to see it. And then it seems kind of like a missed opportunity or leads us to disappointment. And then we could really over-engineer how people are supposed to work, the tools or the roles. We could really over-engineer on that. But if people don't have the clarity of the vision, don't see how their work contributes to strategy, don't see their work actually having meaning, well, then that's just going to hurt performance. So there really needs to be something that ties those two pieces together, from strategy to work. And I think op model org design work actually does it. And I'm very intentional about saying op model org design, as you can tell, not because I'm trying to trademark or sell anything, but when we think org design, people tend to think boxes and lines, structure. And I will sometimes say structure is irrelevant if we get the op model piece right. Now, of course, that's not something I'm going to die on the hill for, but op model, if we think about it, of understanding clarity, not only in the vision, but then what are the capabilities we need to produce the value of that vision? Then we sequence those capabilities so we understand how work is going to flow from inputs to outputs. Within that workflow, we identify what are the decision rights, and where the key decisions happen, who gets to make them, what's the approach we're going to use it, because that becomes the basis of our governance. And then also in that workflow, identifying accountabilities and responsibilities, which gives us clarity in who does what. Once we have that, then we could talk about structure. Then we could talk about how do we want to organize around the work. I think if we have clarity of connection, alignment to vision, capabilities, workflow, decisions, roles, we could do a really poor job on structure, and yet we're still going to probably have a higher performing team. But if we don't get clarity on that, then structure actually usually doesn't help, and a lot of times just gets in the way.
So it's something about really grounding the work that we do as OD practitioners in the realities of the business and the strategic goals and the financial performance and all that, and really making that front and center of what we do.
And I think, like a lot of things in life, when we're focused on one thing, on the thing we're trying to achieve, we actually don't achieve it because we forget about all the things that help us get there. And so if we're only focused on goals, if we're only focused on achieving that business strategy, and yet we forget that we're working in human systems, we forget that people need to understand and have clarity into why they're doing what they're doing and who they're doing it with, we're probably not going to achieve those business goals. So yes, every company has to achieve those business goals. But if we can if we know the elements that create not only that clarity for the workforce, but actually create workforces that can thrive, that means they're performing at a higher level, we're actually going to probably exceed those goals.
And Garen mentioned at the beginning you host your own podcast. How did that come about? What was the driver for that?
So a little over a year ago, I was trying to think of what's my next move. So after 18 years of doing external consulting, and I refer to it as the Goldilocks experience, where I worked for a very small firm, a medium-sized firm, and a very large firm, and decided, it's not working for me. So I need to figure out something next. And I was trying to think, do I start my own thing? Do I go corporate, or what am I going to do? I started talking to other people who were very skilled at running their own business. There was something about the thing they did and really their strength, their superpower, that compelled them to leave a firm or leave a company and go do that thing full time. That not only they had trust in their capabilities, but that they were compelled to do that thing full time. And I really wanted to try to understand that. So I went and had conversations, and I thought these conversations were fascinating and, more importantly, inspiring. And I was thinking to myself, 20 years ago, I had read Marcus Buckingham's First Break All the Rules, where he shares that 80% of employees don't get to use their strengths any single day. And as they define strengths, it's the combination of something they're good at and something they're passionate about. And that was heartbreaking. And then I'm having these conversations with people who are not only working in their strengths every day, but they're like taking a risk, investing in themselves to go do that all the time. That's their full-time job. And I found that to be not only inspiring for me, but it was, how can I amplify these stories to inspire other people? Going back to that 80% who aren't working into their strengths, and not to try to get everyone to start their own business, but what can they do once they're inspired? What are the actions that they can take to find their purpose, to be able to find that superhero talent and do more of it, align their work to what's meaningful to them, and then go have an incredible impact with others. So in these conversations, a couple of people said, hey, we should do a podcast. I'm like, okay, well, the project, I'm a recovering project manager. So I started thinking about what would it take to actually have something that was produced every week that, had a theme, had interesting topics, had something that would pull an audience in. And again, this is another conversation I would have with people where their eyes glaze over as I'm telling these individuals who suggested the podcast, and they're like, no, I just want to hit record. I'm like, okay, cool. I would want to do something a little bit more. So I thought, okay, I need to create the structure for having something that would be compelling, that tells that story, that amplifies the individual, hopefully inspires others, and serves as a resource for OD practitioners, coaches, mentors, and leaders who want to not only get inspired themselves, but are in roles where they get to inspire others to unlock those barriers that are preventing them from achieving their goals.
One of the questions we always like to ask is how practitioners begin. So obviously you've started at Starbucks, and it's an enormous organization with a huge global footprint. When you begin, how do you clarify the scope of the role and what's in and what's out, and get that potential permission to operate? What was the process for that?
Well, it's the same process I've taken throughout my career doing org design, model work. And that's understanding like what does the vision look like? What's our strategic narrative of what this team is trying to achieve and why it exists? And then once we are crystal clear on that message and it's compelling not only to the leaders but to other people in the team, then it's the process of identifying, okay, what needs to be true to achieve that vision? So what are the capabilities we need today? What are the capabilities we're going to need in the future? And do we have those capabilities and how well are we doing those things? So do a little maturity model on those capabilities and figure out what's our growth plan. If we have it today, but it's, not at the level we need it, what's the level we need it at and by when? And that becomes part of our roadmap. And then we start mapping out how do we sequence these capabilities from left to right? And what I mean by that is based on the inputs, and let's make sure we're clear on the inputs. Let's get really nerdy and understand what are the entry criteria for those inputs so we can set expectations with our customers or partners upstream. And then let's, as we like to say at Starbucks, let's run the marble and understand how does work flow from left to right? How does work and what are the capabilities that are engaged to produce that work? So we'll look at core processes for any team and start mapping that out. And we don't get very detailed. We're talking, level 2, maybe level 3 level processes. So we keep it really high level for a couple of reasons. One, it would take too long to do the process mapping on everything. And 2, we just want to create clarity. So the leadership team understands, okay, this is how work flows through the organization. How well do we do it today? And then what do we need to empower the teams to actually improve the conditions of those capabilities? So I'm already getting a little too much on the details on that one. But once we map out those workflows, then we identify where are those key decisions and look at how do we make those decisions today? Who makes them? What's the approach? In the Pacific Northwest, we are very consensus based in our decision making. And it makes a lot of sense to use that approach when the leader either lacks the expertise or the authority to override decisions. If buy-in is really important and everyone needs to follow, yeah, consensus might be a fine way of making that decision. But if a leader has the expertise and has the authority and buy-in isn't as important, well, that leader could probably make the decision themselves. So in the places where we know there's routine decisions, let's go ahead and just call out who has decision rights. What are the various decision rights? Who gets to make the decision? Who gets to provide the recommendation? Who gets to support the decision? Let's identify what's the approach we're going to use in the time frame of how those decisions get made, because then that becomes the basis of our governance. Now we understand, okay, here are the decisions. Are those decisions being made? Are we making them in a timely way? Are they being carried out and are they working? Once we have our decisions and we understand the processes, then we can start identifying who does what. And how do we group that work into what roles and what teams, which then we can, this sounds overly simplistic, but by looking at work volume times roles, we now can build out the front line of any org structure. Around the same time, we're also doing work from top down of understanding what's the best way to organize around this work. So we're looking at primary organizing characteristics. Are you guys playing bingo? I'm trying to hit all the buzzwords.
This is good.
We're looking at those primary organizing characteristics. See, should we be, a lot of organizations are a combination of function and process. Well, what makes sense for this team in managing the work? So we'll do that top down, bottoms up, and then we'll talk about spans. What's the right number of employees to managers? And, if we have to retrofit where maybe our spans got a little out of control and we have, 30 people reporting to a manager, is that going to hit our goals and our values around personal development, professional development? If we have 1 or 2 people reporting to a manager, is that people leader really a people leader, or are they just a player coach? And the idea might be they're getting experience being a manager, but are they really getting the experience, or are the training wheels still on that role? So we'll look at spans. We'll look at what are the right roles and what are the right expectations for those roles. And that informs our structure all the way along. We're taking notes about the things that we need to do in implementation to create the new org that we're going to need. So whether it's training, whether it's relationships, connections, whether it's new mindsets and behaviors and how we're going to identify those throughout, not only identify, but implement throughout the implementation. In all of this, we're taking these things back to the leadership team and say, hey, what are the behaviors that you need to see? What are the mindset shifts you need to see in this organization for us to live into this new vision? And what do you guys need to do right now to start creating the conditions and the environment for those behaviors to show up? So an example of this is I'll hear leadership teams talk about accountability. And this is my favorite buzzword, because if you ask 5 people what accountability means to them, you're going to hear 6 different definitions. And it's anywhere from, hey, when you make a mistake, you call it out, you have a plan to how you're going to fix it, and then you're empowered to go fix it. To, at the other extreme, you don't admit to a mistake because you're afraid of getting punished. And ultimately, I think most people would agree that they want the former, and yet they don't identify the behaviors and actions around that, around not only how do you create the environment for people to do that on their teams, but they're not doing those actions themselves. So let's identify those mindsets and behaviors, and let's be really clear on the do's and don'ts. Outside of a lot of fast food restaurants, they have those signs, no shoes, no shirt, no service. And it's really clear on those expectations. And yet the first guy who walks in without shoes or a shirt is able to order food. Now everyone says, oh, okay, that sign is meaningless. Well, I don't think we need signs outside of our team saying no shoes, no shirt, no service, but we need to be clear on what the do's and don'ts are. And it needs to start at the top, and the top needs to follow those rules to make sure that it's to tell the rest of the organization these new mindset behaviors, actions are not only really happening, but the leadership team is so dedicated to them, they're going to start showing it as an example, right? Simon Sinek has that book about, leaders eat last. Well, that's probably the last thing leaders should do. Leaders should always act first in order to drive those behaviors and mindsets they want to see in the organizations.
So Starbucks is described as like a people-focused, values-based organization. How did you go about because you've worked in lots of different contexts, how did you go about sizing up the Starbucks culture when you went in there to think, this is how they do it here. So this is the standard good practice playbook that you can implement here, but this is a little bit different. This is how we just try to navigate the landscape.
Yeah. So, after 18 years of consulting, and even before that, when I was working in large technology companies, but as a project manager, I was going in and working with various teams every 3 months, 6 months. It was a different team, different set of stakeholders, different subcultures of organizations. And you can see what people value in their actions. And the values on the wall is very different than the behaviors that show up for a lot of organizations. And my relationship with Starbucks is, it goes back a long way because I've been doing a lot of consulting here in Seattle. Might have been a couple engagements that I've done at Starbucks, might have had a few employees that have been there. So I knew a lot about the values going in. And I knew, as it compared to a lot of the other organizations that I've spent time with, I think the part of the asset, the value of this opportunity was that these values actually are lived out on a very frequent basis. And so that was one of the attractions of going in there. But I think anytime stepping into any organization, it's one of the first things I'll do on any project is to do those stakeholder interviews. And usually within the team, sometimes with the customers of teams, and it's to understand like what's working well, what would make you more proud to be a part of this organization, or what would, increase levels of satisfaction working with this team if they're external stakeholders, and really understand, okay, what's the lived experience and what are the values coming out of that? And then when we talk about decision criteria or design principles, the idea of identifying those principles in design is so when you get to make difficult decisions, those decisions are a little easier. And, if we come up with statements such as like, we believe in trust and accountability, that's meaningless. It's meaningless. How is that going to help you inform any decisions later on? It's like, okay, if you had to choose between trust and accountability, which one do you favor more than the others? And how is that different than you're behaving today? Now, I don't know where or how or when you would ever have to choose accountability or trust over one or the other. But I mean, one that I hear in a lot of organizations is around speed and availability. I'm like, cool. Like, if you had to choose between one, which one would you choose? Like, no, we need both. Like, but what if you had to? And let's have that theoretical conversation early on. And if it's okay, 5 times or 6 times out of 10, we're choosing availability. Okay, cool. So now in 2 months, when we have a very difficult decision, we're going to know that when things weren't emotional, when things weren't tense, we said we're going to choose availability 6 times over 10. How does that inform today's decision? And so it's really that process of understanding what are our stated values, what's our lived experience, and then what do we want that to be moving forward for this team? Because every team has its own subculture that should be connected to and driven from the larger organization. But each organization needs to have that clarity around what are the values that we want to uphold and what are the things we're willing to let go of.
And what was your journey into OD? It's a question we're eternally curious about. Did it find you? Did you find it? Like, what was the story?
I started off in project management early in the career. And I think that's just because I've always been curious about systems. And I know that sounds cliche, but it comes from I moved around a lot as a kid, and I needed to understand how systems work so I can not only fit in, but also be able to, try to rapidly show value. And, as humans, we all want to be recognized for what we bring, for what we offer, for what we can achieve. So I think that was something that was developed early on. When I started my professional career, I went into being a project manager because I seemed to be the one person that was interested in organizing work. And I understand, I already had a base understanding of systems, so I could work with people who had deep technical skills and coordinate their work. And then after a couple of years, I started noticing the areas of bad friction, whether it's within the team context, organization context, the supplier and customer relationship. Started thinking about, okay, what are the things that we're doing on a frequent basis that's making the job more difficult? I worked for a technology company that had an annual software release that leaders of the product organization would say, hey, we're going to put 100 features in this next release, and we only need 3% of them to be hits with our customers. So that meant 90% of the stuff we were building was useless. And it's like, how much more work would it take up front to identify what those 3 things could be? And could we actually reduce, like, what if it was 30 features that we developed, and we developed them really well? And what if in developing really well, more people got value out of them? So then you had like maybe 5 or 10 of those features were actually the value drivers. But just this idea of this surplus of disappointment, the people who were working really hard and really got really a sense of value and meaning out of the work that they were doing, to have it be non-value added. What a waste that is. And what a miserable experience that is. And I found myself, I'm actually leading teams down this path. And so it was this idea of what's the role of leadership, of organizations, of ways of working that's creating waste? And what are the easy things we can do to try to eliminate those things in design? What are the things we could actively do when we're executing on work to eliminate or smooth out some of that bad friction? And so I started thinking of that as in a project management, program management perspective, and started thinking about, okay, what could we do around leadership? What could we do around identifying clearer ways of working? And then I realized I had this other epiphany around project management where the focus was on scope, schedule, budget. It was all about scope, schedule, budget. And that was really important to everyone else until we launched something. And then after launching something, no one cared about scope, schedule, budget. It was all about adoption. It was, did we get the value out of it? Did we achieve the R out of ROI? And no one cared about the I. And I'm like, wait a minute, I just spent 12 months busting my butt and busting a lot of chops, try to hit that I, and now no one cares. And I realized this. I was working on a couple agile projects where I got to see end users involved in stating the problem in doing the design work, in helping with the build, and helping with the tests, and helping with the implementation, and to the point where end users are asking for this product or service before it's even ready to be released. And I started thinking, wow, there's something working really well in this process. How do we get end users involved in identifying problems, designing solutions, and then owning those solutions? And that felt a lot like change management. So I started doing change management work and then realized, oh, there's a way we could actually take these same learnings from the space of building products or services to how we organize around work, how we help leaders be more effective at making strategic decisions, communicating those decisions, supporting their teams. How can we make team leaders more efficient at ensuring their people are well taken care of and able to produce and have everything they need, and individuals to be able to produce the work that's meaningful to them, that's meaningful for the company, and that they're developing and growing. And so to some extent, when I look back over the last 30 years, I think I'm in OD now because of the sins I committed early on in my career. But I really think of this natural progression of just understanding things and seeing things in a different way, and then just gravitating towards, oh, I can run projects and programs in ways that actually reduce friction, and in the lean language, reduce the muda, the waste, to, change management. Everyone cares about adoption. And that's the metric that organizations care about a lot more than scope, schedule, budget. So got into change and then realized, these beautiful things we're doing to drive change, actually we could do it in how we shape up workforces and environments. That's how I got into OD.
Did you give yourself permission to keep expanding and moving the variety of your role, or what was the driver behind that?
Yeah, if you talk to anyone I've worked for, probably most people I've had relationships for, this word permission, I don't know what it means. It's one of those things where I think I see an opportunity and just ask, okay, why not? Why not do it that way? And the answer is there's no good answer to that. So it's like, okay, let's go do that. And so I will quickly move into doing things in a way that make logical sense to me, and then find out, I should have got buy-in from other people along the way to bring them along. So it's usually I'll act and then come back and be like, okay, here's the problem to solve. Here's what I'm thinking how we would solve it. Do you agree? Okay, cool. Okay, this is what we've already done, and this is what's in front of us. So that's a recurring theme. I'll own that.
And what do you enjoy most about the work that you do? What really brings you joy?
I like to say that I'm unlocking my potential when I'm working with others to unlock their potential. Okay. And I will often find that, like in the stakeholder interviews, or when I'm having coffee with a leader or a membership of the leadership team, or someone who's in these teams, and they just start sharing their hopes and dreams and start talking about different ways of working. And if we could just smooth out this area of bad friction, or if we can just stop doing this thing or start doing that thing, life would be so much better. And then it's like, okay, well, let's go make that happen. And being able to help leaders, teams, individuals think through, okay, what's getting in my way? And it's usually these limiting beliefs. It's usually stories people are telling themselves, and through history. I mean, there's probably evidence to support those stories, but could we be the author of our own stories in ways that, there are different ways of doing it? And maybe we might have to spend a little bit more time getting other people to buy into our story. But those things are possible. And so why wouldn't you do it? And if it's beneficial for you, most times it's going to be beneficial for the group, especially when it comes to these team dynamics or ways of working together. So why not identify that thing that probably a lot of people are thinking about and spend a little time actually implementing it to make it true?
You said one of the things you talked about is the fact that sometimes leaders can be overly focused on one thing, like the business strategy or a target. I guess the thing I was just wondering is, what in your mind creates that kind of binary thinking, and how do you encourage leaders to take a broader view and actually look? There's a lot of contributing factors that actually enable people to achieve those things.
It seems like a simplistic question, but I think it's really complicated. And I think it really gets into not only those limiting beliefs, the stories we're telling ourselves, whether they're conscious or unconscious stories that we're telling ourselves. I think it also goes to how we measure success and our definitions of success. And you mentioned that book that I wrote, the Project Success Checklist. This came out of a process. I realized, again, I mentioned how as a project manager, I thought it was all about scope, schedule, budget, only to be disappointed over and over again when we built something and we hit those metrics, but then no one used it and people thought of the project as a failure. And I thought about my team, of how horrible it was for that team to go through that experience of working 40, 50, 60 hours a week for months to produce that product, that feature, only to have it be deemed a failure when it actually worked perfectly by design. And I felt like a failure because we didn't produce something of value, but I nailed scope, schedule, budget, like mic drop moment, but no one cares. No one was there to hear that mic drop. So this idea of what does it mean to be successful? And I started doing this thing of like, okay, how do I gamify this? So I would go around and talking to leaders and stakeholders and understand like, hey, in this environment, what makes projects successful? And for this thing we're building, what would make it successful? So I'd get those definitions up front early on. And then I would just coalesce to figure out, okay, here are the top 10 things that are going to make this project successful. Okay, that needs to be in scope. We need to achieve all those 10 things. That needs to be in our risk management plan because the converse of those things will lead to failure. So we need to be doing those things. We need to be measuring against those. We need to be resourced against those things. And if we hit those top 10 things, but maybe slide on a few other things, well, those other things are like, 11 through 100. Like people don't care about those things. They care about the top 10 things. So let's achieve those top 10 things. I think that's an example of using metrics for good, but it required a conversation where I think what I see with leaders, whether, at the team level, organization, enterprise level, is there's a certain metrics that they have to hit. And those metrics make a lot of sense. But if you get so myopically focused on those metrics and you're not focused on the other things that help you get there or hurt long-term performance, hurt long-term relationships, become, bad friction for the future, you might be getting a short-term metric, but you're hurting yourself for the long term. And if you're really focused on that one thing, you might not be achieving the other things that you're trying to achieve. But it's this thing like if we're so focused on that metric, we might be losing focus on the other things that are important that help us achieve that metric. And so I think what I see is a lot of leaders think about the 2 or 3 metrics they're trying to hit and not thinking about everything else that needs to be true to not only achieve that metric for the short term, but also create longer term sustainable success.
When you think about a good OD practitioner, what do you think are the essential qualities that you need to operate effectively?
There's a few things, and I think I can, stand on the shoulders of giants on this one. Edgar Schein's advice around never forget that it's the client who owns the problem and the solution. I think early on in my career, I wanted to be the one coming up with a solution. I thought that was my role, and always disappointed when that solution would never make it off PowerPoint, or if it was implemented sort of half-ass and never achieved what it was supposed to. And then coming to the realization of not only do teams actually come up with pretty good suggestions, and the realization of, hey, I've been thinking about this problem for 3 weeks and they've been thinking about this problem, every day for 3 years. Like they're going to know a lot more about the problem. They're going to know a lot more about the constraints and the context. They're probably going to come up with a better solution for their situation. And then it's their solution. They're going to have a little bit more agency. There's going to be a little ego tied in, a little more agency and a desire to make sure it's successful because it's their solution. So I think there's some wisdom there. I think there's also, I recently heard Peter Block talk about all facilitation is political, which, I was thinking political in terms of like politics, and that I don't think I've come to realize it's not what he meant. He meant that we all have our own biases and we all have our own agendas and perspectives. And we might, I have a friend who likes to say this, and it's so true. All perspectives are valid and partial. And I think about that, including mine as the facilitator. So I need to be really careful about my biases and what I'm trying to achieve. This is where I lean a little bit into my coaching practice around coach the person, not the problem. Allow the team that we're working with to be focused on the problem and creating the solution for the problem. I'm just there to help facilitate them through the process. I'm there to ask them questions. I'm there to keep them on track with what we're trying to do, but be open to explore the things that they need to explore. I think there's also something really important about managing the container, using more coaching language, managing the container in which we're doing this facilitation with teams. And another friend likes to say, no one has a monopoly on the truth. And there's something so disarming about that within teams of like, you might really hold on to your truth really tightly, but realizing that everyone else has truths that they believe, and that all of, tying back to the other part about all of them could be partial. Like, how do we find a shared truth? And how do we come up with a future vision or a future thing we're trying to achieve that we all buy in? And if we can create a container that allows people to be vulnerable, to show up fully and participate, to have fun, then we're gonna create a container in which these things are possible. Now, if we come in with tools and we come in with diagnostic, like, you guys rank 3 out of 100 on trust or accountability, those diagnostics are valuable to start conversations. But if we don't create the containers to have those conversations in a very healthy way, those conversations are going to be very different.
Are there any sort of tools or methods that you really enjoy using that you just find they're like the Roger Kastner go-to kind of tool?
I would think the thing that I'm enjoying using the most, that is the most illuminating with teams right now, is a process that I learned from a trusted advisor friend that I used to work with. And it's a process that she would refer to as semantic differential. Now, when I was a client that was, or a consultant that was charging, a lot of money for each slide and for each, buzzword, I would call it semantic differential because it sounds really smart and even has its own Wikipedia page. But really in more, everyday people's terms, it's this or that. And it's really looking at what are 2 possible positive outcomes. And the question would be, what's the focus today and where should the focus be in the future? So an example, for a leadership team, we have innovative and harmonious. So the leadership team could be innovative and everything that comes with that, or it could be harmonious. And what's the focus today? Is it very, somewhat, very? And where the focus is today and where do we want it to be in the future? Now, if the team is very harmonious today, and it wants to be very innovative in the future, it's like, okay, cool. That's a big leap. What do we want to agree upon as the behaviors of what it looks like to be innovative? This is not giving everyone carte blanche to come in and be a bunch of jerks with each other. We don't want that. But what does it look like? How are we creating space for us becoming innovative? So we identify those 2 really values and then have a conversation about what that means. Now, in some of these pairings, there's usually 8 to 10. If today's focus and future focus are on the same thing, cool. We don't need to talk about that. But the thing where there's that big spread between future and where we're at today, that's a great place to have a conversation, and let's drive it into behaviors and actions. And then let's check ourselves in 3 months. Are we showing up in that way? Are we showing up in ways that are innovative without being a bunch of jerks, as the example?
What do you find most challenging about the work that you do?
Yeah, I think it leads to disappointments for myself, in that when I'm in that space of helping teams imagine what's possible, we paint very rosy pictures. We get really excited about what's possible. And then as we're working through the details and constraints come in and realities come in and where we are today versus what's possible, and there's people coming in and out of the team over time, this original vision gets watered down a little bit. And so then maybe we achieve 70% of that original vision or 80%, which is really good based on where they were when we started off. But I'm sitting there going, yeah, 100% would have been cool. Like I get really excited about that potential. And then I have to realize again, the growth that they've made just in the conversations and then over time, what they're able to achieve. That's really good. And I think that's the work that I do that stands the test of time. Our org structures, our operating models, those are like sandcastles that will be disappeared with the ebb of the tides. And just as new leaders will come in, new strategy will come up, orgs will shift and move in various ways to the point where that old structure, that old operating model is no longer relevant. I can live with that. But if we've helped leaders actually understand what it takes to not only achieve business results, but also create workplaces that thrive and create leadership teams that can thrive together, if they take that away, I feel like I've earned my paycheck for that day.
One question you kind of touched on a little bit, but we just want to explore a bit more detail. So how do you measure success in your role? Like, how do you account for the work that you've been doing?
It comes up in what leaders say to me during and after the engagement. So once we've implemented the project and the leader comes up and says, "Thank you for the work. I know it wasn't easy. We were pretty hard to work with." They all say those things. And then they'll say something like, "You really pushed my thinking. You made me think different. You did make me a little uncomfortable. You made my, go to places that were uncomfortable. You poked and prodded and you helped me come up with a better solution. Thank you." When I hear that, I know I've done my job. There are times I know I do that and I don't hear it from a leader or from a team. And that's a little disappointing, but I know that their org, their op model is different because, I push them. That feels good. The thank you, the recognition also feels really good too.
And what would you say are the biggest lessons you've learned if you look back at your career?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to that, the Edgar Schein of letting clients own the problem and the solution being the biggest lessons and the biggest change in my work. And when I first discovered it, it was like, whoo, I need to work a lot less. And then what I learned to be true is like, oh no, I need to shift efforts from, rather than coming up with solutions, to creating the environment in which teams can have those conversations in really fruitful, healthy ways that are actually setting up the team to operate differently in the future, that they will own the problem and they will own the solution. But the quality of their solution depends on that container I create. And that's been true whether it's in the org design work I do, operating model work I do, all the OD work I do, when I'm coaching clients, again, coaching the person, not the problem, letting them own that. And it comes back to even podcasting. As you guys know, there's a structure to it, but it's the guest that is really going to breathe life into it. You're just creating the container for them to amplify their message and to maybe even find meaning in the conversation.
Obviously, the podcast is a big part of your personal development. How do you invest in your own learning and development?
A couple different things. So, one, I'm in a book club where we read fascinating books, and the types of books that we pick are very random, and we get introduced into a wide range of subjects. We read Annika Harris's Conscious. It's all about consciousness, all the way to reading. There's the books I suggest, and not everyone loves those books, but the conversations are great about them. And sometimes the best conversations come out of the books that we don't like. But, we're covering ground from, consciousness to maybe Adam Grant's Hidden Potential and all spaces in between. I recently got trained in coaching, so I joined a 9-month program to up my skills in coaching, and it was fascinating to really learn more about myself than necessarily the techniques or tactics of how to coach. And I think it's going to help me not only be a better coach, but also be a better OD practitioner. As we talked about, creating the container and allowing clients to own their problems and their solutions. And then right now it's the podcast that is given me the opportunity to talk to a wide range of people to understand what what is it about the thing that they do and why do they do it? That becomes so fascinating. And yeah, there's little like tips and tricks. And I will state at the beginning of the podcast, we're not trying to like learn a new talent, but we are learning a lot of things from these clients about how they, or the guests about how they do what they do. So there's definitely some value there, but the goal is to get inspired about what is it that they have found to be true along their path of living into their potential. And so this whole first year of that podcast, I've been learning about purpose. What is purpose? How is it formed? What are some of the, the origins of what happens in early stage development, or, are we actually born with a purpose? So learning more about that, to how do we fulfill that purpose? And then, is purpose enough to help us achieve our potential? And the answer is no. There's more to it. Purpose is our North Star. It's our compass. But what are the other things that we need that actually help us like achieve what our potential is? What I need to be able to understand is like, how do you define potential? Like how would you come up with a number or a diagnostic of what is your potential in this skill or this capability or this mindset? I don't know if I want to take that on. I'm just right now trying to learn what's the foundation and what are the elements of potential. And that's fascinating to me.
If you can crack that, patent it. So we're going to give you one quick bonus question, because obviously you talked about books, and a lot of the people that watch this are inspired by the books that they read. Are there any particular books that you've read along the way that have like really the sort of challenged your thinking, or, sped or accelerated your learning?
Well, it's a bonus question. Do I get bonus answers? Do I get to give you more than one? The first book that I think I recommend to more than any other book would be The Speed of Trust by Stephen M.R. Covey. Not because it's not a great read. It's probably like 4 pages of good content and then 250 pages of story. The elements of trust that are in that book is so accessible, and so like everyone just will connect to it very quickly. Like the elements of trust: integrity, intent, capabilities, results. People who have a lot of integrity, intent, but they don't have capabilities and results. You're not letting them watch your dog over the weekend. People with a lot of capabilities and get results, but you don't know about their integrity and intent. Still not letting them watch your dog for the weekend. You need all 4 of those things to be able to have someone who's really trusting. The best way to earn trust, the fastest way, is through capabilities and results. The fastest way to lose trust is violation of integrity and intent. Those are the 4 pages. Go buy the book. Let's make sure Mr. Covey gets some of his royalties, but so valuable. And I'll set that up with every leadership team I work with. I'll set that up. I'll have that conversation, and they're like, oh, here are the behaviors where we need to see more trust from one another. The other book that I read that I thought was really helpful was Dr. David Rock's Your Brain at Work. And in that book, he goes into the threat and reward response that we have whenever we come across a new stimulus, and the whole SCARF model. And if you're familiar with SCARF, it's status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And the neuroscience tells, at least tells David Rock, and he makes it and puts it in plain language so I understand it, is that people will either have threat responses or reward responses in those 5 areas. And you can anticipate someone's response, threat or reward, based on those 5. Even better, you can go ask them questions and see, hey, if this thing happens, how do you feel as far as like, what's that going to do for your reputation? Is it going to amplify it or be a threat to it? Do you know how to operate in this new world with this new thing? Does this new thing hurt or amplify your ability to make decisions and have choice of how you do your work? Does this thing take away your ability to work with your team or to be the go-to person? And lastly, fair. Does it seem fair that this is happening? You could have these conversations, and it changes, not only it improves the ability to understand what people are going to need through change, but it also creates connection between a manager who asks those questions of their people, and that relationship only gets stronger through having that conversation. And that's one of the big principles that I come across, or that I want to do in the work that I do. I've talked a lot about clarity, super important. I talked about co-creation, how important it is to get, the people closest to the problem coming up with the solutions, because they come up with better solutions that will be implemented at a higher rate. But this last piece around connections, and this is something that we're getting further and further away in the workplace, from, whether it's the, hybrid work and remote work, whether it's the use of technology and, having meetings via Zoom or Teams instead of being in the same room. That loss of connection, I think we see throughout society, and we're seeing like some really scary numbers around, rates of loneliness, anxiety, depression, suicide. Not that work has to be the solution for some of those problems, but our manager, and, spend 5 minutes on LinkedIn and you'll see the studies that people are quoting around, like, your manager has a huge impact on your mental health. Like, maybe we need to equip managers to show up in ways that build stronger connections with their people. We need to invest in that. We don't do that. I've seen too many organizations that want to put a lot of money into leadership development and nothing into their frontline managers. And yet, who do the frontline managers work with? Majority of people in the company, the people who do the work, that produce the value of the work, and we're not investing a single dime in those managers. Or at least if the performance of the company is important, which it is, why are we spending money for leadership development when leaders have probably already received that learning, that training, that assessment, whereas the frontline managers haven't? They've been promoted because they're high-performing individuals. They've never had experience of being a manager, and they've only seen what other managers have done before. And we're not investing in those frontline managers. That's a problem. And that's where connection is hurt in organizations. And those managers get promoted to directors, and they get promoted to VPs. And then pretty soon you have people that are all focused on technical skills and have, very little adaptive skills, that aren't building connections. And yet the research is clear. It's those adaptive skills that create higher performing teams.
The question we like to ask all of our guests, and we finish off with this every time, is what advice would you give to somebody who's considering kind of working in the OD field?
Recently, I had someone who had just graduated with their master's in org development. How are they going to get a job in org development? And at least from what I've seen in the roles that I've seen in companies I've come into contact with, rarely is there an org development role. There are leadership effectiveness, org effectiveness, team effectiveness, learning and development, change management, org design roles, but there's not an org development role. And so my advice was, like, the area that you feel that you have capability in, go for those roles, whether it's change management or leadership development, go for those roles. And then when you're in those roles, look to see how you can, sort of like spread your scope of work into those other fields, and start picking up that work. And getting exposure to it and being able to get some bullet points for the resume, of experience in that work. But I think it's more likely that you're going to get a role in one of those pillars rather than in the umbrella. I don't think umbrellas have pillars, but you know what I mean. Usually my metaphor game's a little bit better. Yeah. But, that's what I've seen. And that was my experience. And that's the experience I've seen of other people, that, change management is the gateway drug into OD. It just expands from there rather than getting an OD role where you have all that work. And I think I mentioned this at the top around org design and op model work. The beautiful thing about it is you're going to see all the dysfunctions within an organization. You're going to see all the places where they thrive and all the places where they get in their way. And so, after you've gotten into, after you've done change management and you pick up those skills and you understand, what people are motivated to actually make change happen, then come on over to org design, because you're going to start seeing where you can apply those same skills and capabilities of helping people change behaviors, change actions in the op model org design space, because there's going to be plenty of opportunity to do that. in the ways of working and the ways that people are creating either bad friction for their teams and organizations, or the issues that leaders are having with one another that really show up in their teams. I think the first step on that OD train is change management. And then whenever you can, jump over to org design, because there's a lot of fruit in that garden.
Brilliant. Well, I want to say a huge thank you, Roger. Thank you for getting up very early in the morning, because there's a huge time difference. Congratulations. Of all the guests that we've had so far, you are the furthest one away at 5,000 miles. So thank you. But just want to really say thank you for just a really articulate, clear, real kind of sort of shedding a light on your method and your practice as well. So I think people that are watching this will have got so much value from that. I know that we have as well. Danny, what are you going to be taking away from this?
Oh, huge amounts, but I think a couple of things that really stood out were the importance of creating good containers for the people working with to have good conversations, and the importance of that. The client owning the problem and the solution is so important. It's so easy to fall in a trap of not doing that and trying to fix everything for them. And the importance of setting expectations and being really clear on those.
Thank you guys so much for this opportunity. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you both. I've been a fan for a long time, and I'm really, really appreciate the good work that you're putting out into the world and helping other people learn more about not only what it means to work in the OD space, but I think there's also just some good work and value in OD practitioners learning from other OD practitioners, whether they're, in year 1 or year 30, where we can learn from each other and get better to do the work that we love and get a lot of meaning out of. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Brilliant. And if people want to follow your work, if they want to follow your brilliant podcast, what's the best way for people to do that?
So the podcast, this is a learning edge for me. I should have probably named it something a little easier, but it is What Do You Know to Be True? So there's a website, whatdoyouknowtobetrue.com. It's available on all the platforms, including YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. It's just such a passion play for me. I love, and it's just so grateful to be able to have stumbled into hosting that podcast and the great conversations I have. My email address is roger@3bluepens.com. Maybe next time I'll take up an hour telling you how I came up with that name. And then LinkedIn is also a great place to engage with me, as I'm no short on providing opinions when it comes to all things OD and really around the spaces of clarity, co-creation, and connections.
Well, thank you so much. Your interview joins a very worthy collection of other OD practitioners as well. And I know that people get a lot of value from it. If you want to follow, we are literally launching a new episode every single week. So Roger's will be out very, very soon. If you subscribe to the channel, then just be notified. And again, like Roger's, it's available on YouTube and all the other platforms as well. So thank you so much for watching. And thank you again, Roger, for joining us all the way from Seattle.
My pleasure. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.